Red alarms blared across Goldman Sachs' trading floor as chaos erupted in the heart of Wall Street, transforming the normally calculated atmosphere into a scene of unprecedented panic. Trader James Morrison stared at his screen in complete disbelief, watching numbers that defied everything he understood about global finance and cryptocurrency markets. A new digital currency from Africa had shaken global markets to their very foundations, and the impossible was happening before his eyes in real time. At that very moment, 8,000 kilometers away in a modest presidential office in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré sat calmly before his laptop, fingers poised over the keyboard, about to press the final sequence of keys that would reshape the world's financial landscape forever and establish Africa as an unexpected technological superpower. The morning of March 15th had started like any other ordinary day on Wall Street, with traders arriving to their desks clutching coffee cups and scanning overnight market reports from Asian exchanges. But by 6:47 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, Morrison knew with absolute certainty that he was witnessing history in the making, a moment that would be studied in financial schools for generations to come. The Bitcoin chart he had been tracking religiously for 7 years, watching its every fluctuation and building his career around its predictable patterns, seemed completely frozen in time, its decade-long dominance suddenly challenged by something entirely unprecedented and technologically superior. Morrison's hands trembled uncontrollably as his eyes darted to the adjacent monitor, where new digital currency called AfriGold was displaying transaction volumes and processing speeds that made his years of experience seem obsolete overnight. Within mere hours of its mysterious launch, this unknown African cryptocurrency had not only matched Bitcoin's performance metrics but had surpassed them by margins that seemed mathematically impossible according to every financial model he had ever studied. The implications were staggering and terrifying for every Western financial institution that had built their cryptocurrency strategies around Bitcoin's technological limitations. Morrison's colleagues gradually gathered around his workstation as the full scope of the situation became clear, their faces reflecting the same mixture of disbelief and professional concern that had overtaken the entire trading floor. The financial instrument they were observing wasn't following any conventional cryptocurrency patterns that Wall Street understood or could predict. While Bitcoin continued struggling with transaction fees that often exceeded $50 per transfer and processing times that stretched beyond 10 agonizing minutes during peak usage, AfriGold was executing millions of transactions simultaneously with fees barely reaching a few cents and completion times measured in fractions of seconds. The technology behind this African innovation was clearly operating on principles that challenged everything Wall Street thought it understood about blockchain architecture, cryptographic security, and distributed ledger systems. Senior analysts who had spent years becoming experts in Bitcoin's proof-of-work consensus mechanism found themselves completely unable to explain how AfriGold was achieving such superior performance while apparently consuming 99% less energy than any existing cryptocurrency network. Meanwhile, in the presidential palace of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré maintained an atmosphere of calculated serenity and focused determination that contrasted sharply with the global financial panic his revolutionary creation had triggered across international markets. 3 state-of-the-art laptop screens displayed real-time data streams from around the world, comprehensive global market reactions, detailed AfriGold network performance metrics, international news coverage of the unprecedented financial event, and security monitoring systems tracking attempted cyber attacks from sophisticated international actors who were desperately trying to understand or disrupt the new system. The man who had once been dismissed by Western leaders as an idealistic young president with unrealistic ambitions was now quietly orchestrating a financial revolution that would fundamentally reshape Africa's relationship with the global economy and permanently alter the balance of international monetary power. Traoré's journey to this moment had begun 3 years earlier, during a devastating banking crisis that had frozen Burkina Faso's foreign currency reserves for 6 months, leaving millions of citizens without access to their life savings and exposing the brutal reality of Africa's financial dependence on Western institutions. Technology Minister Dr. Amina Keita entered the presidential office carrying comprehensive technical reports that confirmed what their development team had hoped for but barely dared to expect during 3 years of secret, intensive preparation. The AfriGold system was not only functioning flawlessly under the enormous pressure of global attention, but was actually exceeding every ambitious projection they had made during the system's clandestine development phase. The revolutionary network was processing over 2 million transactions per second across 43 African nations simultaneously, maintaining zero downtime despite massive international traffic, and operating security protocols that had already successfully repelled dozens of sophisticated cyber attacks from well-funded international criminal organizations and hostile state actors. The genesis of AfriGold could be traced back to a pivotal moment of clarity 3 years earlier when Traoré had witnessed firsthand the devastating human impact of Western financial control on African economies and communities. During that crisis, when European banks had arbitrarily frozen African government accounts over minor diplomatic disagreement, leaving hospitals without medicine budgets and schools without teacher salaries, Traoré had made a decision that would ultimately alter the destiny of an entire continent. Rather than continuing to operate within a financial system explicitly designed to extract African wealth and maintain Western economic dominance, he would create an entirely new financial ecosystem centered on African values, controlled by African institutions, and designed to serve African development priorities. The proof of heritage consensus mechanism that powered AfriGold represented a fundamental philosophical and technical departure from traditional cryptocurrency models that prioritized pure computational power over social benefit. Instead of rewarding miners for solving arbitrary mathematical problems that consumed enormous amounts of electricity while contributing nothing to human welfare, the AfriGold system allocated tokens based on measurable, verifiable contributions to community development and social progress. Farmers who implemented sustainable agricultural practices that improved soil health and crop yields, teachers who established rural education programs that increased literacy rates, healthcare workers who expanded medical access to underserved communities, and entrepreneurs who created local employment opportunities that reduced poverty all earned AfriGold tokens proportional to their documented social impact. This revolutionary approach had quietly attracted the attention of idealistic blockchain developers and cryptocurrency researchers across the globe, many of whom had abandoned lucrative positions at major technology companies to join the AfriGold project despite intense pressure from their governments and former employers. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a former senior Ethereum developer who had relocated from Silicon Valley to Accra to work full-time on AfriGold's development, had described the system as the first cryptocurrency that actually improved the world rather than simply enriching early adopters and creating speculative bubbles that inevitably collapsed and destroyed savings. The immediate global reaction to AfriGold's public launch revealed the true depth of Western financial institutions' economic dependence on African resource extraction and monetary subjugation. Within hours of the system going live and processing its first international transactions, emergency meetings were hastily convened in Washington, London, Paris, Frankfurt, and other major financial centers. Central bank governors who had never given serious consideration to African monetary policy or technological capabilities were suddenly scrambling to understand how a single African nation had developed revolutionary financial technology that surpassed their most advanced institutional systems. Federal Reserve Chairman David Richards found himself in the unprecedented and deeply uncomfortable position of having to explain to increasingly hostile congressional committees how Africa had achieved technological supremacy in a field that American politicians and business leaders had always considered their exclusive domain and natural birthright. The questions from senators were pointed, persistent, and uncomfortably revealing of fundamental American ignorance about African capabilities. How had supposedly sophisticated American intelligence agencies completely failed to detect such a significant technological development occurring right under their surveillance systems? Why were major American corporations already scrambling to integrate AfriGold into their global operations despite government pressure to maintain traditional financial relationships? And most disturbingly for American political leaders, what did AfriGold's success mean for the dollar's historically unchallenged role as the world's primary reserve currency? The European response proved equally frantic and revealed similar underlying assumptions about African technological inferiority. European Central Bank President Catherine Mueller called an emergency session of the Bank for International Settlements, demanding immediate coordinated action to contain what she hysterically termed an existential threat to Western monetary hegemony and the established international financial order. The bitter irony was not lost on informed international observers that the same financial institutions that had spent decades systematically extracting wealth from African nations through currency manipulation, debt traps, and unfavorable trade agreements were now terrified of African financial independence and technological self-sufficiency. China's reaction to AfriGold's emergence proved characteristically more nuanced, strategic, and ultimately more pragmatic than Western responses. While Chinese officials maintained careful public neutrality to avoid appearing to directly challenge American financial dominance, they quickly recognized that AfriGold represented an unprecedented opportunity to undermine Western monetary control without directly confronting the United States in traditional geopolitical arenas. Within 72 hours of AfriGold's successful launch, 3 major Chinese state-owned corporations had quietly announced their intention to conduct all future African trade exclusively through the new currency system, effectively bypassing dollar-denominated transactions that had historically benefited American financial institutions. The extraordinary technological sophistication of AfriGold became increasingly apparent as international experts began conducting detailed analyses of its underlying architecture and discovering innovations that challenged fundamental assumptions about cryptocurrency design. Unlike Bitcoin's notoriously energy-intensive mining process, which consumed more electricity annually than entire developed nations while contributing nothing to human welfare, AfriGold operated on a quantum-resistant blockchain architecture that used 99.7% less energy while processing transactions at previously impossible speeds and maintaining security standards that exceeded all existing cryptocurrency systems. The revolutionary system incorporated advanced artificial intelligence algorithms that automatically adjusted transaction fees and processing priorities based on economic need and social impact, ensuring that essential transactions like food purchases, medical payments, and educational expenses received absolute priority over speculative trading activities that contributed nothing to community welfare. This intelligent prioritization system meant that a rural farmer buying seeds for the next planting season would always have their transaction processed before a wealthy speculator attempting to manipulate currency markets for personal profit. Perhaps most impressively from a technical standpoint, AfriGold security protocols had been designed and implemented by a consortium of brilliant African cybersecurity experts who had carefully studied and systematically surpassed every known vulnerability in existing cryptocurrency systems. The revolutionary network employed a sophisticated multi-layered encryption methodology that combined ancient African mathematical principles with cutting-edge quantum cryptography techniques, creating security measures that were simultaneously rooted in traditional African knowledge systems and positioned at the absolute forefront of technological innovation. International hackers and cybercriminals who attempted to breach the AfriGold network quickly discovered that they were facing security measures that adapted and evolved in real time, learning from each attack attempt and automatically strengthening defenses against similar future threats. The system's artificial intelligence security protocols could identify and neutralize sophisticated attacks within milliseconds, making successful network breaches virtually impossible even for well-funded criminal organizations with access to advanced technological resources. The profound economic implications of AfriGold's success extended far beyond simple currency exchange or speculative trading opportunities. For the first time in modern history, African nations possessed a financial instrument that operated completely independently of Western institutional control and political interference. No longer could European or American banks arbitrarily freeze African government assets during political disputes or diplomatic disagreements. No longer could international monetary institutions like the IMF or World Bank impose devastating structural adjustment programs as conditions for accessing basic financial services or international credit markets. Africa had achieved true monetary sovereignty for the first time since the colonial period, and the psychological impact of this achievement proved as significant as its immediate economic benefits. African leaders who had spent decades negotiating from positions of enforced weakness suddenly found themselves holding unprecedented leverage in international economic relationships, able to demand fair terms and mutual benefit rather than accepting exploitative arrangements designed to perpetuate Western economic advantage. This newfound financial independence manifested immediately in dramatically changed power dynamics across the African continent and in Africa's relationships with international partners. Within 1 month of AfriGold's successful launch, 14 African nations had announced their intention to conduct all international trade through the new currency system, fundamentally altering global commodity markets and trade relationships. Oil exports from Nigeria, diamond sales from Botswana, gold shipments from Ghana, copper exports from Zambia, and rare earth mineral sales from the Democratic Republic of Congo began flowing through AfriGold networks, generating substantial transaction fees that remained within African financial institutions rather than enriching foreign intermediaries. The transformative impact on ordinary African citizens proved even more dramatic and personally meaningful than the macroeconomic changes that captured international headlines. Small-scale farmers who had previously been systematically excluded from formal banking systems due to Western institutions' discriminatory practices suddenly found themselves able to access credit facilities, crop insurance, and investment opportunities through AfriGold's integrated financial services ecosystem. A cocoa farmer in Côte d'Ivoire could now receive fair market prices for their crops by selling directly to international buyers through blockchain-verified transactions, completely eliminating the exploitative intermediary relationships with Western commodity traders who had historically captured most of the value in African agricultural supply chains. African entrepreneurs seized the unprecedented opportunities created by AfriGold's success with remarkable speed, creativity, and business acumen that contradicted decades of Western stereotypes about African innovation capacity. Within 6 months of the currency's launch, over 50,000 African technology startups had emerged, all built around innovative applications and services that leverage the AfriGold ecosystem to solve uniquely African challenges with African-designed solutions. These dynamic companies were developing everything from drought-resistant agricultural monitoring systems that helped farmers optimize crop yields, to solar-powered internet access points that accepted AfriGold payments and brought digital connectivity to previously isolated rural communities. The educational revolution that accompanied AfriGold's international success proved equally transformative for African human capital development and intellectual infrastructure. African universities began offering advanced degree programs in blockchain development, cryptocurrency economics, digital finance, and related technological fields that had previously been dominated by Western academic institutions with little understanding of African contexts or needs. Bright young Africans who might once have felt compelled to emigrate to Europe or America to access cutting-edge educational opportunities now found world-class programs and exciting career prospects available in their home countries. International corporations initially responded to AfriGold's emergence with skepticism, attempted suppression, and various forms of economic pressure designed to maintain existing exploitative relationships. However, Market forces and African determination quickly compelled even the most resistant multinational companies to adapt their business models to new African realities. When major African copper producers announced that they would only accept AfriGold payments for their strategically important exports, global electronics manufacturers faced a stark and unavoidable choice: embrace the new financial system and accept African terms for fair partnership, or lose access to essential raw materials that their industries could not function without. One by one, prestigious multinational corporations that had spent decades extracting African resources while contributing minimal value to African development began establishing AfriGold accounts and integrating the revolutionary currency into their global operations. This corporate capitulation to African financial independence represented a fundamental shift in international economic relationships and marked the beginning of a new era in which African nations could demand genuine partnership rather than accepting continued exploitation. The dramatic transformation of global power relationships became unmistakably evident at the World Economic Forum in Davos, where Ibrahim Traoré's presence commanded international attention and respectful consideration that would have been completely unimaginable just a few years earlier. Western political leaders and corporate executives who had previously lectured African counterparts about economic management, good governance, and financial responsibility now found themselves seeking Traoré's insights on technological innovation, monetary policy, and sustainable development strategies. The young president, who had once been patronizingly dismissed by senior Western officials as inexperienced and idealistic, was now universally recognized as a visionary leader who had fundamentally altered global economics and demonstrated African intellectual and technological capabilities that Western institutions had spent centuries denying or suppressing. Traoré's transformation from dismissed idealist to respected global leader reflected broader changes in international perceptions of African potential and achievements. Tesla's CEO Alexander Hayes exemplified the corporate world's forced adaptation to African financial independence and technological leadership. His company's desperate need for African lithium, cobalt, and other rare earth minerals essential for electric vehicle production meant accepting Traoré's non-negotiable terms: full manufacturing partnerships that created African industrial jobs, comprehensive technology transfer agreements that built African technical capacity, and profit-sharing arrangements that ensured African communities benefited from their natural resources rather than merely serving as sources of cheap raw materials for foreign corporations. The era of simple resource extraction was definitively ending, replaced by mutually beneficial relationships based on African demands for fair treatment, shared prosperity, and genuine technological partnership. Western corporations that had historically approached Africa as a source of cheap labor and raw materials were now compelled to offer African partners meaningful collaboration, advanced training, and substantial profit-sharing arrangements that reflected the true value of African contributions to global supply chains. The remarkable success of AfriGold inspired broader technological advancement and innovation across the African continent, creating a positive feedback loop of achievement and ambition that surprised international observers who had underestimated African capabilities. Within 18 months of the currency's launch, African nations had successfully established the continent's first indigenous satellite internet constellation, ensuring that every African citizen could access the digital economy regardless of their geographic location or local infrastructure limitations. Rural villages that had never had reliable electricity or internet connectivity suddenly found themselves connected to global markets through innovative solar-powered AfriGold transaction terminals that operated independently of traditional telecommunications infrastructure. These technological leaps allowed African communities to participate directly in international commerce without depending on exploitative Western intermediaries who had historically captured most of the value from African economic activities. The profound psychological impact of AfriGold's international success proved as significant as its immediate economic effects in reshaping African self-perception and global recognition of African capabilities. For the first time in centuries of colonial and post-colonial exploitation, Africans possessed a technological achievement that the rest of the world sought to emulate, study, and integrate rather than exploit or suppress. Young Africans who had grown up believing that innovation, technological excellence, and global leadership were exclusively Western attributes now saw concrete evidence that African creativity, intelligence, and determination could lead the world in cutting-edge fields. International academic institutions began aggressively recruiting African blockchain developers, cryptocurrency economists, and digital finance experts with the same intensity they had once pursued European and American talent for their research programs and technology companies. The brain drain that had systematically depleted Africa of its brightest minds for decades began reversing as opportunities at home surpassed those available abroad, and ambitious young Africans chose to build their careers on the continent rather than emigrating to developed countries. 1 year after AfriGold's transformative launch, James Morrison found himself in a position of bitter irony that perfectly illustrated the broader changes reshaping global finance. The Goldman Sachs trader who had initially panicked at the currency's emergence was now managing his firm's largest and most profitable AfriGold portfolio, leveraging his newly acquired understanding of African markets to generate substantial returns for American investors. His specialized knowledge of African economic dynamics, once considered completely irrelevant to serious international finance, had become the most valuable expertise in his firm and the foundation of his rapidly advancing career. The Federal Reserve's eventual grudging accommodation to AfriGold's undeniable reality marked a historic shift in global monetary policy and American economic strategy. After months of failed attempts to suppress, undermine, or co-opt the African currency through various forms of economic pressure and diplomatic manipulation, American officials quietly began holding substantial AfriGold reserves alongside traditional currency holdings. The dollar's decades-long monopoly on international trade was definitively ending, replaced by an increasingly multipolar financial system where African institutions played central roles in determining global economic policies and trade relationships. European banks that had built their enormous wealth on centuries of African exploitation and resource extraction found themselves desperately scrambling to maintain relevance in a rapidly changing world where Africans controlled their own financial destiny and could choose their international partners based on mutual benefit rather than historical subjugation. Many traditional banking relationships dissolved permanently as African nations chose to work exclusively with institutions that offered genuine partnership rather than continued paternalistic exploitation disguised as development assistance. The paternalistic attitudes and racist assumptions that had characterized Western African financial relationships for centuries became not just morally questionable but economically obsolete as African financial independence made Western approval or permission completely irrelevant to African success and prosperity. European and American institutions that refused to adapt to new realities of African empowerment simply found themselves excluded from the continent's growing markets and technological innovations. As Ibrahim Traoré sat in his familiar presidential office 2 years after launching AfriGold, carefully reviewing detailed reports of the system's continued expansion and remarkable success across multiple continents, he reflected deeply on how profoundly the world had changed since that pivotal moment when he had pressed those final keys. The revolutionary currency that had begun as a tool for African financial independence had evolved into a powerful catalyst for global financial democratization and technological advancement. Countries across the global south were developing their own blockchain-based currencies explicitly modeled on AfriGold's proven success, creating an entirely new international financial system based on principles of equity, sustainability, and mutual benefit rather than exploitation and wealth extraction. The young leader who had once been dismissed as a naive idealist by seasoned Western politicians was now recognized internationally as one of history's most significant financial innovators and a visionary who had permanently altered the trajectory of global economic development. But for Traoré personally, the greatest satisfaction and sense of achievement came not from international recognition or prestigious awards, but from the knowledge that African children would grow up in a world where their continent's vast wealth served African development priorities rather than foreign enrichment, where African intelligence and creativity were recognized and celebrated rather than suppressed and exploited, and where African nations could determine their own destinies rather than accepting terms dictated by former colonial powers. The revolution that had begun with a digital currency had become something far more significant, a complete transformation of Africa's relationship with the modern world and a demonstration that African solutions to African challenges could also benefit humanity as a whole. AfriGold had proven that African innovation could lead global technological advancement while remaining true to African values of community, sustainability, and shared prosperity.